over. This is not something you get to have come back. So your creativity is not going to be solved by how many dollars I can hoard. Because hoarding dollars already has lost, if you look at just pure currency, it's lost 42% of its value in the 48 months that precede today. So hoarding dollars is a depreciating asset. You can have as many as you want. They're worth half their value. If you keep them for a longer period of time, they'll be worth less. At some point, we'll actually wake up and say, okay, we've got to do something else. Our imagination is going to be required to come up with what does it mean to exchange value that is not dollar denominated. It's an opportunity to create those things. And on a microcosm, we're already seeing the emergence of things. And I hate to use these references because they sound a little too trendy, but there's a kind of an early indicator in this where you see things like Craigslist, you see things like a lot of the online network exchange situations where people are now moving off of currency. I would go as far as to say that, you know, when eBay came out, they actually violated a federal law because they actually were passing currency and doing finance outside of a bank charter, which is an interesting proposition, which is also mildly illegal. But they got away with it, which is an interesting racket, and they got away with it for good reason, so kudos for them. But the fact of the matter is, the ability to move e-transaction money, virtual value units across the internet, has already presaged where we're going. We are going to come up with other utilities to do value exchange. And part of our responsibility is going to see if we can do it without betting that the future is going to be about just perpetually pushing off the debt financing. Remember that the debt financing that we currently have is principally in two places: trade imbalances and treasuries. We are one solvency event away from letting the Treasury just blow up. Okay? And if you do the math on it, we already have, but we just still have the window dressing. So it's already insolvent. We don't have a GDP to support it, and we sure as heck don't have a GDP growth to support it. Because if you take away wartime spending out of our GDP, I would argue we are already in the R word and possibly in the D word, but we've got a war that does a nice job covering that up. The fact of the matter is, we're already there. So this isn't debating whether we can stave off something. We decided not to stave something off when we let a country go carelessly into a perpetual checkbook being written against a war that actually cannot be defined in a win-lose outcome-based metric. There won't be enough GDP. There won't be enough to support it. So guess what? We're going to charge it off. That charge-off is going to come with massive geopolitical. So that phase is over. A new phase is up.
So David, on the macro scale, and it would appear from this discussion, that a lot of previous discussion, but we're going to need clearing facilities for the valuation, validation, and risk rating of these alternative valuation investment units, whatever we would call that, for transactional clearance and so forth. So how do you see that reemerging out of this kind of Phoenix proposition? How do we bridge into that where both the policy frameworks and so forth can begin to embrace this as a possibility for bridging?
Yeah, I think there's an interesting question. You know, one of the things that neither candidate, and back to the observation about Obama or McCain, one of the things that both candidates have operated with is a fundamental assumption that says taxes are how we generate revenue for the country, and tax rebates are how we buy votes. But taxes are how we generate revenue and how we build investment income. And somehow or another, we believe that taxes are the framework that we're going to use in perpetuity. That's also over, by the way. I mean, we are actually going to have a non-federal mediated transaction that is already, and I would argue the China deal in Iraq has already proven that the federalized value denominating transaction clearinghouse function has already left our shores. When China can come in and denominate a contract backed by U.S. Treasuries to actually get oil futures out of Iraq, which is the country we just annexed, that whole issue shows us that the sovereign notion of a currency, clearinghouse, colonial, empirical, however we want to state it, that paradigm has broken already. What's going to happen from a clearinghouse standpoint is probably going to be something that you'll see emerge, and the first test of it probably already is emerging in the EU with Codex Elementaris. Codex Alimentarius, for those of you not familiar with it, is the rule that governs the movement of food-related stuff between foreign countries and the European Union. And Codex Alimentarius has become a new means of controlling who wins and who loses in international trade deals. It's not the value of a trade deal that you get into or not get into. It's actually whether you can even sell what you wanted to sell. A wonderful example of this is in Southeast Asia. A huge amount of the world's honey production is done in Southeast Asia. It turns out that the bees in Southeast Asia have a very small latent fungal infection and a viral infection. It's never created a problem for anybody, but under Codex Alimentarius, it's now illegal to move any honey containing that particular genotype of both fungus and virus into the European market. What that effectively did was, with no overt currency, with no overt trade policy, it actually shut off the GDP contribution of several Southeast Asian nations into the EU. Why did they do that? They did it because they decided to leverage non-currency, non-commodity values, in this case, the ability to control a favorable market for more expensive honey production in EU, and actually erased the contribution from the global commodity market of honey, the contribution from Southeast Asia. Now, you can look at that situation and understand that what happened was, through an entirely non-commercial, non-monetary, non-fiscal policy situation, you changed the GDP balance, and then went in and, oddly enough, proposed all kinds of offsetting trade deals to those countries which were favorable to the EU. So you weaken the country by killing their GDP, and then you come in as the savior saying, yes, but we'll let you do this. Now, EU got away with it, kind of. But that clearinghouse function, which has already been broken in this example, is raising the awareness of the need for the clearinghouse. So in some respects, some of the early fits and starts for alternative transfers of value have, and they will, by the way, they'll have failures, they'll have successes. The failures will hopefully inform us about what doesn't work, and the successes will inform us about what does. And so I would argue that what will emerge is probably a much more homogeneous, now world homogeneous view of how you do the intra-party restitution as well as intra-party recognition of value exchange. But ultimately it's going to happen the way it happened on the Silk Road. You know, the funny thing about the Silk Road is you started with a diverse world in China. You actually ran it through all of Central Asia. You got it into the Middle East. You got it to the Mediterranean. And 9 times out of 10, what started in the caravan in China and what ended up in the ports in the Mediterranean bore no resemblance to each other. The reason is because the silks were traded off for the spices, and the spices were traded off for the precious metals, and the precious metals were traded off for the feathers. And by the time you got there, everybody in the UK wanted feathers in their hats. Well, that's an interesting racket. Somewhere along the line, what started out here as silk ended over here in feathers, and then people bought the feathers. That's how it worked. And it worked, by the way, for about 1,000 years, not for the 100-year experiment that hasn't worked for us. So how did that work? How did the Silk Road work? It worked because the spot commodity transaction that said, your silk is worth my spices. Now, my spices is worth your gold is worth my, rubies or whatever else. Your rubies are worth my feathers get on the ship and go to the European continent. That's a pretty whack system. But it worked. And it built some of the longest productive economies that this world has seen. We're going to be back there. We are actually going to have spot commodity trading that may not be centrally denominated. Ooh. Spot commodity trading that may not be centrally denominated. And guess what? That's how humanity has worked most of its existence. That's how it's going to work again.
All right, David, let's do one more. We've been here over 2
Okay.
hours. Sherry, hang on, sorry. Sherry's got it.
I'm curious if you have any idea about what the migration patterns are going to be as we go through this. I find myself looking just at the U.S. right now, and the fact that we're already starting to migrate toward value centers.
Yep.
And myself particularly, who I've been in training now to be part of this, how do we redesign microcosms in communities like this that are actually very locally based and have a global context to happen? Where's going to be the best place to start to make this transition? Because the value of having somebody listen to somebody like you is if they actually get what you're saying, you won't have to experience as much
That's exactly right.
crisis actually start making the change before the crisis happens.
Yeah.
So we've got this gap now between people that start to get it and people that aren't going to get it. And how do we like position ourselves, and I'm thinking more geographically, about the new systems that are emerging as? Do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, and let me give credit where credit is due. And by the way, for those of you interested in my affiliations, I do not have a religious affiliation. So I'm going to give you an example to help answer the question. The example is the Mormon Church. The Mormon Church began a process about 7 years ago, which is very interesting, by the way, just to kind of put you in the cosmology and metaphysical space. About 7 years ago, they actually started investing in strategic real estate, which were denominated by agriculture areas that had their own source water environment. They did a calculation, and they have a very elaborate calculation, by the way, about what it takes to feed their congregants. And by the way, it's not just a calculation for, Berkeley Springs and the greater Berkeley Springs vicinity. It is around the world. So when you go to Samoa, you go to, Indonesia, you go to all over the place, they actually have a calculation that says, what does it take to keep our people alive?
That's 12 million.
Okay? That's what their calculus is. And what they did was they actually looked at real estate, not for its face value, but it's for its utility value in a prospective sense. So they paid, quote, out of market rate to actually buy things that had aquifers, springs, rivers, water access, agrarian capacity, everything else. And they are places like Madagascar, where you look at land purchases in Madagascar and you find out that the LDS are buying it up left and right. And you go to places like Samoa and you find out they're buying up plantations left and right. They're all over the world, and they've done that calculus. Now, what can we learn from that? What we can learn from that is that we have to reapproach how we view society. We created urban density under the assumption of almost zero-cost energy. Now, that's an overstatement, and I'm admitting to the overstatement. But we said we can generate power remotely, ship it across hundreds of miles of cable or lines and everything else, and that works because we can overgenerate, we can pump as much as we want through the grids, and it works out well. And we've got a great highway system and train system and infrastructure, so we can actually take stuff from a port, put it on a boxcar, send it halfway across the country. It all works out well. That works in, relatively speaking, low frictional energy cost environments. The minute the energy cost changes, that stops being as attractive a model. And we have to now start thinking about what is the space. I mean, Eric was talking about driving through Pennsylvania. You go through Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and you see a farm, what? Every mile, every half mile? No. You see 10 farms a mile. Why? Because they figured out the critical mass of what it takes to actually not only farm for your subsistence needs, but what you need to actually participate in the economy. So somewhere along the line, the Amish, the Mennonites, the Mormons, there are people who have figured this out. And if you look at how they're doing their development, we could learn a lot if we sent our urban planners into those environments. If you look at how European and even Central and Southern Asian countries have done their urban planning, they actually do mathematic calculations that say X, acres or hectares of rice required for Y population density, and you only build within that capacity. Where China's gotten itself into trouble is its coast. Because its coast, it decided to do urban density. Works great in free oil, it works great in free energy, sucks if you actually have to grow rice. And that's going to be a real problem in China. But that's one of the fundamental issues we can look at right now and say, how do we start moving population centers, actually decentralized population, I know that sounds heretical, but decentralized population so that you actually have a proportionality to subsistence, access to water, energy, and food, and then have the ability to participate in a networked economy. You're going to see the emergence, once again, investment opportunities. You're going to see the emergence of local, very local, energy production and storage. That's going to be a huge market. Huge market. And I'm not talking about a bunch of silicon solar cells. I'm talking about some places it's going to be biomass, some places it's going to be silicon, some places it's going to be hydro, some places it's going to be geothermal, some places it's going to be a whole bunch of other things, some places it's going to be algae, where you actually grow algae in ponds and figure out how to make biodiesel out of that.